Immediately after the intimate backyard ceremony, I heard laughter over an old baby monitor that had sat on my dresser for years. A voice I had welcomed as family, my new daughter-in-law said, with the flat amusement of someone who felt no guilt, that she'd married my son to take the house. I was folding towels when the cup of tea slipped from my fingers and soaked the floor, but I didn't move. Her words repeated in my head like a record skipping. I married him for that house. The old woman won't see it coming. Let me finish this. For years I had treated her like a daughter. I sewed curtains with her, helped choose her wedding dress, cooked dishes when she asked. She kissed my cheek after the vows and called me mom in a way that felt genuine at the time. Now that same voice on the monitor turned those small kindnesses into something brittle. The receiver's speaker clicked. I refreshed the batteries and tucked it in the bookshelf, hands trembling but steady. I did not call my son. I did not crash through their bedroom door. Instead, I moved like someone mapping a storm, quiet, deliberate. She moved in the night she married him, rolling her suitcase across the threshold as if the house were already hers. Elijah smiled like a man who'd been given a miracle. I smiled back because he looked happy. The changes started small. New curtains that replaced the ones I had sewn. A boxed-up record player, framed photos that shifted positions until one went missing. At first, I blamed my own sensitivity. I'd lived alone long enough to let a few things shift without complaining. Then I heard the plan. Her laughter through the monitor was cold and amused. She spoke of a doctor who would declare the old woman unfit, of paperwork and gentle pressure, of turning neighbors' concern into legal evidence. I felt my world tilt. That afternoon I pulled an old recorder from a drawer and tested a microphone behind a framed map. I found my husband's tape deck in the attic and dusted it. Old tapes of Elijah playing piano at 8 years old rolled smooth when I set them on the heads. The house had a history. I would make sure it spoke. From then on, my life became a series of small, intentional acts. I let the kettle boil over on purpose once, so it could be cited later as proof of distraction. I left a sweater in the freezer and purposely misplaced the car keys, tucking them into the piano bench. I planted tiny, reversible slips that would look like evidence if someone wished to build a case. At the same time, I recorded conversations, tested microphones in the den and dining room, and labeled the files with dates and short notes. Their voices were easy to catch once I paid attention. She had an accomplice, a man with a practical voice, who advised patients. He said to wait for a medical report, to bring in Dr. Ellis when the time was right. He promised that Elijah would sign his name to almost anything. I duplicated what I could and hid originals where they would be safe. The house, which had always been quiet in the afternoons, grew to listen. I did not want to make the drama worse by confronting him half certain. Elijah was busy at the clinic. He trusted her. I chose instead to gather proof and find someone who would take it seriously. I drove into town and handed a flash drive to a clerk at the county office who introduced me to a legal liaison. He listened like someone who had seen this before and explained the right steps: duplication, documentation, and notification. He arranged 4 copies to be stored at the courthouse and taught me how to secure my own records. There's a strange kind of calm that follows the moment you realize you are being targeted. It is not heroic. It is precise. You stop yelling and begin filing. You collect names, dates, recordings, and deeds. You keep living baking the lemon cake, answering the phone with the same voice you always had because surrender would be the victory of someone who had planned all along. The house, which had been the archive of my life, wedding photographs, taped piano pieces, a husband who taught me how to patch a roof, was worth guarding. I intended to guard it well. After the first clear recording that named a doctor and sketched out a plan, the nights changed. I slept less and listened more. The recorder in the pantry had caught her voice discussing a medical evaluation and a certain man Victor advising patients. Their script was patient and clinical. Wait, arrange the paperwork, and let the paperwork do the heavy lifting. When I played that conversation back, I felt the air go thin, like someone had pulled a curtain across a familiar window. I began to stage small incidents that would look like the kinds of slips one makes with age: an overboiled kettle, a misplaced grocery list, one muddy shoe left by the door. Each seemed absurd in isolation, but together they were breadcrumbs that a liar could use. And that Liar, thinking she was clever, started to build the evidence she wanted. She hosted parties, called the house hours when friends came, and with practiced charm, talked about reimagining rooms. She gave tours like a hostess who already owned the stage. Meanwhile, I kept recording. I found more of my husband's old audio gear in the attic: microphones, a reel deck, a pair of directional mics, and cleaned them carefully. I placed the mic behind the mantel, another in the hallway light, and recorded phone calls behind framed maps. I labeled each file. The process was slow and oddly reassuring. To put down facts where previously there had been only suspicion. The recordings made something else possible: evidence you could take to someone official. That is how I ended up at the county courthouse with a canvas tote and a flash drive. The clerk I first spoke to introduced me to Mr. Callahan, a liaison who handled elder protection concerns. He read through a few clips, nodded, and explained how to freeze asset transfers and duplicate records. "You've been careful," he said. "Now we make sure none of it can be erased." Back home, Becca, my new name for her in my head, a small change from what she used to be called, continued her campaign in daylight. She even phoned a local real estate agent, name-checking rooms she planned to open up for sale. She spoke of the home like furniture she could paste into a glossy listing. The house was a ledger of a life. She was erasing entries. The pressure intensified when a man wearing a beige jacket and carrying a leather satchel came to the door. The so-called Dr. Ellis. He asked the standard questions: date, state leader, memory items, and I answered plainly, conserving my composure. I left a small imperfection on a clock drawing, mild enough to register in a testing form but not damning. After the visit, he and Becca exchanged a look I recorded behind a framed map. The evidence stacked up with each careless mention of names and dates. I continued to leave small staged slips to give her fodder, knowing she would take the hint and press for an evaluation. The day she mentioned bringing in Dr. Ellis to Victor, I had already duplicated the key recordings and placed one drive with the courthouse and one in a locked drawer. I also tucked a copy into a baked tin in the hall closet in case the worst came to pass. Gathering proof felt like housework, tedious, necessary, protective. As Elijah remained at the clinic, trusting and distracted, I prepared the paper trail his mind could follow. I wasn't plotting to humiliate anyone. I only wanted to make a pattern so clear that his denial would not hold. When he finally found the accordion folder with forged forms, his face went quiet. He said, "I should have seen this sooner." And the confession was its own wound. He did not yet understand how deliberate the campaign had been. When he began to read the recordings and see the trail of calls and names Victor Stewart, a regional consultant, something shifted. The tactic that had been so methodical began to unravel as we assembled the evidence into files and affidavits. Mr. Callahan helped secure copies and arranged for a preventive response if the forged paperwork moved forward. The legal machinery started to turn. It was dull and municipal phone calls, notarized statements, labeled drives, but it was the opposite of the secrecy she'd been relying on. The flashlight of daylight makes liars clumsy, and she began to make mistakes. When Elijah placed the original deed on the kitchen table, the house seemed to inhale. Evidence and care had converged into a force that a charm could not overcome. I had been stoic and patient because I believed in the slow work of documentation, date, record, label, secure. It had been tedious, and it had been everything. Elijah suggested a quiet dinner, just the three of us. There would be no audience and no pageantry. It was the kind of evening that can quietly rearrange the truth. I spent the day restoring the rooms she had rearranged. Floral curtains back in place, the mantle photograph returned, silver polished. When Becca arrived, she wore a deep wine blouse and a practiced smile. The conversation began like any other. Weather, neighbors, a podcast she liked. Then Elijah slid a short, factual statement across the table. He read out a list of finding signatures that were not mine, calls to a regional consultant, appointments I had not scheduled, mentions of a doctor to perform an evaluation. Her composure broke into tiny pieces. She tried to deny and to dramatize, but the stage had been taken away by something quieter. Facts. Elijah handed me the deed in its original form. And for the first time since that laugh in the monitor, the house felt steady under my feet. She left that night not with fury but with a carefully maintained indifference that had an edge of triumph. The small town echoes began immediately. A letter from an attorney, threats of defamation, and demands for settlement. We expected the noise. Mr. Callahan told Elijah to provide an affidavit that confirmed I had acted freely and understood the changes to my trust. Elijah signed without hesitation. The legal reply we filed deflated the petition within a week. The papers were withdrawn without explanation. We didn't celebrate much. Healing was not cinematic. It was the slow, ordinary work of putting things back, fabrics, photographs, and the cadence of daily life. Elijah started doing small projects around the house, fixing a wobbly table leg, regluing a lamp socket. He returned to the old tape deck and found an 8-year-old recording of himself playing piano. He put it in and listened. The room filled with the younger sound of him laughing and hitting the wrong notes, and something in both of us unclenched. We also did practical things. Changed locks, installed a simple porch camera, and moved the most important documents to a safer place. More importantly, Elijah began therapy and showed up more often. His apologies turned into actions, more time, quieter attention, notes he'd tuck into his pocket as reminders to be present. Samantha, an old school friend, appeared with cinnamon rolls and an uncomplicated kindness that felt like sunlight in a house that had been too long shaded. I returned to the community center and signed up for a baking class. It was not just about learning a new recipe. It was about being among people who shared things without an agenda. Martha, a woman who liked my lemon bars, became a friend. The small rituals of community laughter over a shared recipe, a neighbor bringing soup prepared more than one wall. Legal letters stopped coming. The petition challenging the trust was withdrawn. No public fight. No fireworks, just an administrative end that matched the private recovery. We filed the last notices with Mr. Callahan and put the backups where they could not disappear. Evidence had done what charm could not. It had anchored the story in a world that carried weight. Even after she left, small traces remained: an old envelope from an attorney, a faint perfume on a scarf. Those were reminders to be guarded, not to live in fear. Months later, over a cup of tea, Elijah and I sat with boxes of letters from my husband and me from decades ago. We laughed at our younger selves, repaired some photographs, and hung the portrait back up on the mantel where it belonged. The house stopped complaining underfoot. The floorboards eased. It would be naive to say we emerged unchanged. The experience sharpened both my attention and Elijah's. We learned that deceit can be kind and soft-spoken, and that ordinary appointments, whispered suggestions, can be used to rewrite a life if left unchecked. We learned to keep ordinary acts visible. Sign here, date there, file copies, and show one another. Above all, we learned the quiet power of documenting truth and of listening when something feels off. In the months after she left, the house's ordinary rhythms returned. Morning sun on the table, Elijah bringing home bread, the occasional whiff of wood smoke. The formal legal threat dissolved. Her petition was withdrawn. Her attorney's letter stopped. Word in town said she'd moved away. There was no dramatic courtroom scene, no confession-only absence. In the emptiness she left, we found room to restore what had been pulled apart. We made practical changes. Locks changed, a modest porch camera installed, important papers moved to a safe deposit box. But what mattered most was the slow reclaiming of our days. Elijah went to therapy, not as a performance, but as care. He started small rituals, fixing a hinge, setting the table, and began showing up in ways that rebuilt trust more than words could. He kept a small leather journal and jotted down things he wanted to do differently, tiny promises that added up. I signed up for the baking class at the community center. Folding pastry became a metaphor, gentle shaping of fragile things until they held. Martha and other classmates tasted my lemon bars and talked about weather and recipes without agenda. It felt like a balm. We also cleaned the attic and found an old binder of letters between my husband and me, yellowed paper and handwritten jokes. We read them aloud and laughed at ourselves, and that laughter was a kind of stitch. There were echoes, an envelope slipped under the door, the faint trace of perfume, but they were just that, echoes. I burned the goodbye letter I had once written as a contingency by the creek behind the house, watched the ash rise, and felt a quiet finality. The drives with recordings remained where they'd been duplicated. One at the courthouse, one in a fireproof box in the house. Evidence, I learned, is not only armor, it is an instrument of memory. Neighbors checked in more often. Samantha became a regular presence, not to fix anything but to hold company. Days filled with simple things, walks on the path behind the house, tea on the porch, the sound of Elijah humming while he fixed a drawer. The floorboards stopped complaining, as if relieved to be remembered. The trust and the deed were secure. The legal notice that affirmed it arrived, and we filed it with the others. The experience left mark. I sometimes noticed a reflex and alertness to small absences, but the reflex softened with each shared meal, each repaired photos, each slow conversation. Time and attention did the rest. The worst had passed, not because of spectacle but because we had been patient, meticulous, and willing to let small facts add up into an unshakable story. If you find yourself facing something similar, someone who charms and then erases, document, duplicate, and share. Find a clerk who listens. Back up the recordings. Ask for help. The work is quiet and often tedious, but it is effective. In the end, the house became ours again, not through drama but through careful stewardship, paperwork, presence, and the willingness to listen when a small detail feels wrong. We keep the photographs and the tapes. We bake, we walk, and we attend to the small, ordinary things that make a house a home. The quiet we recovered is not emptiness, but peace, patient, earned, and fiercely guarded.